want to take a moment today to talk about the upcoming election. I especially want to talk about the role demographics will play in what I think is likely to be an Obama victory due to the makeup of Latinos, women, and working class whites, specifically in Ohio, in the election 12 days from now. No, I don't. No. I want to talk about zombies. When I spoke to an assembly a few years ago about the rising zombie menace, I got a lot of quizzical looks. What is it about you and zombies? And that's a fair question, because people are either zombie-philes or they just aren't. But I'd like to start by talking about horror archetypes. There are a few different horror archetypes: the zombie, the vampire, the monster, the werewolf. Each of those archetypes means something different, represents something different in our collective fears and our need for catharsis or emotional release. First, vampires, I guess, because those god-awful Twilight books. The vampire can represent any number of things. Like zombies, they're undead and represent conflicting ideas about mortality. But essential to vampires, at least since Bram Stoker wrote Dracula, is the idea of sex and seduction. Vampires prey, usually on women, and they often seduce rather than overpower. This is a very Victorian idea about sexuality, but it lingers with us to this day. In recent years, the Anne Rice novels represented the idea of the vampire as seduction in the age of AIDS. The fear of vampires is wrapped up in the idea of rape, death, and the loss of virtue. Even more recently, we had cultural phenomena like Buffy the Vampire Slayer upend those old ideas. The Twilight series is an embarrassing return to the idea that seduction and rape are somehow the same thing. So in my opinion, vampires suck. The werewolf is a different archetype. Werewolves represent the idea that within civilized man resides a beast that can emerge at any moment. But the werewolf doesn't seem to be able to carry a story of his own, and frankly, the best werewolf movie is probably American Werewolf in London, and that's not a ringing endorsement of the genre. More complex and malleable is the monster. Monsters don't stand for any one thing, but are rather a blank slate on which to write whatever morality tale you wish. Frankenstein was the original monster story, and that was about the sin of scientists playing God, the sin of pride. In the 1980s, there were a slew of monster movies like Friday the 13th or Halloween, where any time a teenager wandered off to have sex or smoke pot, they were pretty much guaranteed to wind up with a pitchfork through their windpipe. Jason Voorhees and Michael Myers were agents of retribution, and the only ones to survive were those who remained pure. So a monster can be whatever you want it to be. There was a recent low-budget movie called, appropriately, Monsters. It was technically a variant of the monster movie, the Alien movie, but the idea was the same. The question the movie asked was, who are the real monsters, the aliens or the human beings? A good monster movie will force some questions along those lines. Now, zombie movies are kind of all of the above. Like vampires, they deal with complex ideas about mortality. Like werewolves, they often raise questions about human savagery. And like monsters, they're, monsters. So why zombies? The original zombies came out of Haitian culture, but the modern zombie movie begins with George Romero. He was making a critique of what he felt was brainless consumerism. To Romero, the modern American had become mindless appetite, in effect, zombies. But more recent zombie stories have not really driven home that idea specifically. There's a cultural critic named Chuck Klosterman who wrote a column trying to explain why zombies were making a comeback. He said something interesting. A single vampire is a huge menace. Same with a monster or a werewolf. A single zombie is no problem. They're usually slow and dim-witted with all the dexterity of lawn furniture. There's a great scene in the zombie comedy Shaun of the Dead where the two main characters argue over which records to throw at the very slowly approaching zombies. One zombie is not a problem, but a ton of zombies sure is. And Klosterman's point was that the zombies are therefore a metaphor for 21st century life. There's no one thing in our life we can't handle, at least on most days. Everyone here can probably handle a French quiz or an English paper or an away game at Deerfield. It's having to handle all three on the same day that causes problems. A single email is not a problem. It's having 140 in your inbox that ruins your day. It's not the individual crises that destroy us. It is the relentless beatdown of waves of smaller crises that gets us. Zombies. And while I think that's a clever interpretation, I don't think that's what explains the appeal of zombies. Fellow zombiephile Doc Benedict suggests that we are already beset by zombies, not in the form of ravenous cannibals, but in the form of the brain-dead herd. For most of our lives, we are anesthetized, numb to the world around us. We follow fads and trends. We cede our judgment to our peers. To fight these zombies is to heroically stand up to the herd mentality. And this is pretty close to the original George Romero idea of zombies. In fact, when Romero made his most recent zombie movie, he set it in a shopping mall. And while that recalls his critique of consumer culture, the shopping mall is also the same no matter where you go. There's nothing original or creative about the mall. It's the dead end of individuality. And that's a pretty good theory too, and one I ascribe to, but not fully. For me, there's something else. It's eschatology. And what is eschatology? It is the study of the end of the world. Vampires don't end the world. Although the recent movie Daybreakers took a crack at a vampire eschatology, werewolves don't end the world. Monsters don't usually end the world unless they're aliens or zombies. Zombies beg the question, what do you do when the world you know comes to an end? The dramatic appeal of the TV series The Walking Dead has little to do with makeup effects or fight scenes. What really drives the show is how the small group of survivors interact with each other when everything that previously held their world together has been stripped away. If I wanted to combine Klosterman and Benedict's thesis with mine, I would say that daily life, with its slouching repetition, does not offer you much chance to stare your true self in the face. Instead, there's student you, athlete you, son or daughter you, friend you. Those roles are all social constructs. What happens when society falls away? What happens when necessity calls on you to be a hero? Keeping up with your homework or your emails does not make you a hero. Heroism today is hard. I'm trying hard to be a hero for my sons, for instance, and frankly, it would be easier to fight zombies. We live in a sanitized world. In the modern world, death is parceled away, wrapped in brown paper, laid in a box, and sealed up. We rarely see death anymore. It's an abstraction. We don't confront the gritty realities of mortality or survival. Instead, we watch Bear Grylls or, yes, The Walking Dead. We watch a scripted version of the end of the world because scripted versions allow us to control on some level those awful fears that we lock away. My guess is that each of you probably has a type of horror story that you like, if you like any horror stories at all. I don't imagine horror stories appeal to those who have seen real horror in their lives. I also think that some people aren't necessarily ready or interested in confronting their fears. But if you have a type of horror story or film you like, consider why. Certainly the shock treatment horror films like Paranormal Activity have an immediate cathartic release. They build tension, build it, and then shock or startle you into an adrenaline-soaked release. That's pretty basic stuff. And to me at least, not terribly interesting. Similarly, I don't care at all about tormented vampires who sparkle in the daylight. Please. But there is a part of many of us that likes to be scared, especially in the safety of a theater or our rooms. We like to take our darker imaginings out, hold them at arm's length and examine them. If we confront our nightmares often enough, our nightmares cease to have a hold on us. And maybe that's what my fears are telling me, that I worry about the end of the world. I grew up in the shadow of the Cold War nuclear threat. When I sat in Bingham 2.5 decades ago, I was well aware that the basement of this auditorium was a fallout shelter. I don't worry quite so much about that specific threat anymore, but that fear clearly left an imprint on me. And so, zombies. The collapse of civilization and the ruin of mankind. And that's why I watched The Walking Dead and 28 Days Later, because that fear, while dormant, maybe even vanquished, needs to be kept in its place. And that was the point of the first Halloween. To confront not just death, but the things that lurk in our nightmares. To give them a day where we acknowledge our irrational fears, our dread, or macabre side. And it's not a coincidence we take this day, at this time of year, when the leaves begin to wither and die, and the light fades sooner and sooner each day. It is not wrong to be afraid, perhaps. There are plenty of things worth fearing. And probably zombies and vampires and monsters are not the most reasonable things to fear. But then fears aren't reasonable, are they? That's what makes them fears. And that's why we must look into what we fear the most. Mindless conformity, the banality of evil, the inevitability of decay. We must look into that so that we don't let it control us. Courage, after all, is not the absence of fear, but its mastery. Because once you've found a way to cope with the zombie apocalypse, that English paper is a snap. Thank you and happy Halloween.